Travis Runnels, December 11, 2019. In 1993, Runnels was convicted of burglary of a building, receiving a 5-year prison sentence, and was placed on probation. Later that same year, he was convicted of another burglary, which brought an additional 5-year sentence and resulted in the revocation of his probation. 2 years later, in 1995, he was convicted of aggravated robbery with a deadly weapon, a firearm, which extended his sentence by another 70 years. By Wednesday, January 29, 2003, Runnels was serving his 8th year of the 70-year sentence at the Clements Unit of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice in Potter County. At the time, he was assigned as a janitor in the prison boot factory. According to testimony during his trial, Runnels was angry that a transfer request to work as a barber had been denied. That morning, he told fellow inmate Bud Williams that he was going to be shipped one way or another and that he intended to kill someone, specifically warning that he would kill the factory supervisor, Stanley Wiley, if Wiley said anything to him. Runnels also told another inmate, William Gilchrist, that he planned to hold the factory manager hostage after other correctional officers had left. When Runnels arrived at the boot factory, he informed inmate Phillippe that he was going to do something significant that day. During the first work shift, the 30-year-old Runnels approached Wiley, raised a knife, tilted Wiley's head back, and slit his throat. Afterward, he wiped the knife clean with a white rag and returned to the trimming tables. When Yo asked why he attacked Wiley, Runnels replied that it could have been anyone as long as they was white. Yo reminded him that killing Wiley could result in the death penalty, to which Runnels replied, "A dead man can't talk." The medical examiner found that Wiley had suffered a 23-centimeter or 9-inch cut on his neck, which was deep enough to reach the spine and sever both the external carotid artery and the internal jugular vein. Runnels pled guilty at his trial. During the sentencing phase, the state presented evidence of prior violent behavior, including an incident in 1999 when Runnels struck a guard in the jaw. Between Wiley's murder and the trial, Runnels also had thrown urine, a light bulb, and feces at prison guards. However, 7 inmates who had interacted with Runnels on the day of the murder testified under cross-examination that they had never known him to be violent before that day, and that he had cooperated with prison officers following the attack on Wiley. This included Bud Williams, who had known Runnels for 8 years. Runnels' attorneys did not call any witnesses on his behalf. They had contacted his mother, father, grandfather, and brother, but the brother refused to travel to Amarillo, and the grandfather rendered himself ineligible to testify by remaining in the courtroom. The mother and grandmother left for home before being called, and when attorney Kathy Garrison phoned them, they told her there was nothing they could do for Runnels and hung up. The jury accepted Runnels' guilt plea in October 2005 and sentenced him to death. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals affirmed the conviction and sentence in September 2007. In his appeals, Runnels argued that his guilty plea had been involuntary, claiming that his attorneys had misled him into believing they would present a more substantial defense during the sentencing hearing and potentially help him avoid the death penalty. In 2001, the Court of Criminal Appeals remanded the case so that Laura Hamilton, one of Runnels' attorneys, could testify about this issue. After a live hearing, the trial court determined that Runnels had received constitutionally adequate assistance from counsel, and the Court of Criminal Appeals affirmed this ruling in March 2012. All subsequent state and federal appeals were denied. After the U.S. Supreme Court rejected Runnels' appeal in 2019, he wrote a letter to the Houston Chronicle stating, "Never at any point have I not accepted responsibility for my actions, but I can't silently take an unfair shake of justice." In a final appeal to the Supreme Court, his attorneys argued that Runnels' death sentence was invalid because of false testimony presented by A.P. Marilat, an expert witness for the state during the sentencing hearing. Marilat had testified about Texas Department of Criminal Justice inmate classification rules, suggesting that Runnels would pose a threat to prison staff and other inmates unless sentenced to death. Runnels' attorneys claimed that much of Marilat's testimony was either outdated or inaccurate and therefore unconstitutional. Marilat later acknowledged in an interview with the Texas Tribune that he might have been wrong, but maintained he had not deliberately misrepresented any facts. He noted that while two other Texas death sentences had been overturned due to similar false testimony, in those cases the inmates had minimal or no prior criminal histories. The courts generally uphold death sentences unless the jury relied specifically on false testimony. Marilat added, if the jury gave him the death penalty because of his particular crime and the heinousness of it and the actions he committed after his crime, then the jury's verdict should stand. If they gave him the death penalty because of what I said and I was wrong, I don't want him to have the death penalty. Janet Gilger van der Zanden, one of Runnels' attorneys, stated that he had true and authentic remorse for the death of Mr. Wiley. Runnels' execution was delayed about 30 minutes while prison officials awaited a response from the Supreme Court, which issued a brief ruling denying his appeal around 6:30 p.m. Three of Runnels' female friends and two of his attorneys observed the execution from a viewing room adjacent to the death chamber. Wiley's sister, Margaret Robertson, and her husband observed from another viewing room. Outside the prison, several hundred Texas corrections officers stood in formation. When the warden asked Runnels if he wished to make a final statement, he declined. He did not verbally accept responsibility nor express remorse in his final moments, though he did smile at his friends and mouthed words, even blowing them a kiss after the lethal injection was started. He did not acknowledge the room where Robertson and her husband were located. Moments before his death, he uttered "woof woof." He was pronounced dead at 7:26 p.m. John Stephen Gardner, January 15, 2020. Shortly before midnight on Sunday, January 23, 2005, the Collin County Sheriff's Department received a frantic 911 call from a woman who reported that she had been shot, that her head was hurting, and that there was blood everywhere. She identified her attacker as Stephen Gardner and said he had fled the scene in a white pickup truck with Mississippi license plates. The dispatcher, Erin Whitfield, later testified that the caller's speech was extremely slurred, sounding as though she was choking and vomiting, and the line eventually disconnected. A sheriff's deputy arrived first at the home, followed shortly by paramedics. The victim, Tammy Gardner, 41, was transported by helicopter to Parkland Hospital in Dallas. Investigators found no signs of forced entry, nor did it appear that anything had been stolen. The first deputy on the scene noticed a white pickup in a ditch a few miles from the victim's home, though at the time he did not know it matched the suspect's vehicle. On the morning after the shooting, investigators noted that John Gardner, 49, had used his credit card to purchase gas and work gloves in Marshall, Texas, near the Texas-Louisiana border. Detectives attempted to reach Gardner and his family in Mississippi. Around 8:30 a.m., Gardner returned a white Ford F-150 that he had borrowed from his brother-in-law. His sister, Elaine Holyfield, who had been told that Tammy had been in an accident, asked what happened. Gardner did not respond verbally but cried silently, then showered, changed, shaved, and went to his parents' home. Holyfield checked her husband's 44 Magnum revolver, which was kept under a mattress, and saw that the cylinder contained 5 live rounds and 1 spent cartridge. Gardner then went to the sheriff's office in Mississippi. Detectives called to speak with him, explaining that no arrest warrant had been issued, but that they wanted to question him regarding Tammy's shooting. Gardner responded calmly that he would speak if she wanted to, then returned home. Meanwhile, Tammy remained in a coma at the hospital, and her family removed her from life support 2 days later. Gardner was arrested on Tuesday, February 1st, and returned to Collin County for trial. Investigators found his fingerprints and the tag from the gloves purchased in Marshall inside the brother-in-law's truck. Tammy and John Gardner had married in 1999. According to Tammy's close friend, Jackie West, Tammy had been afraid of Gardner due to ongoing physical abuse and repeated threats of death if she left him. In December 2004, Tammy borrowed money from her employer and filed for divorce. West testified that on Christmas Day, Tammy told Gardner to move out, prompting his parents to return him and his belongings to Laurel, Mississippi. After filing for divorce, Tammy seemed to perk up, marking the date of the finalization, 7 February 2005, on her work calendar, though she admitted she feared Gardner would kill her before that day. Tammy's daughter Jessie and her boss Candace Atkins also testified to Gardner's abusive behavior and threats. On January 20, West and Tammy had lunch together. West testified that Tammy's phone rang incessantly with messages from Gardner, who pressured her about the divorce and sent texts asking yes or no. Jessie read some of the messages aloud, causing her mother to panic. That evening, Tammy drove Jessie home from church while Gardner continued sending texts. Later, Tammy called David Young, her company's vice president, seeking advice on disappearing, and stayed at his home from around 7 p.m. to 10 p.m. They spoke again by phone until 11:13 p.m. Additional testimony from Gardner's brother-in-law revealed that he never left spent casings in his revolver, which was always fully loaded. Evidence also indicated that when Gardner had relinquished a set of keys to Tammy's house in December, he had retained a second set for himself. Forensic and medical evidence determined that Tammy's death was caused by a gunshot to the head. The bullet entered her right front temple and exited below her left ear, passing through a pillow and out the bedroom window. The bullet itself was never recovered. Evidence suggested that she was shot while sitting up in bed, her head against the pillow. In Texas, a murder qualifies as capital if one or more aggravating factors are present. Prosecutors argued that Gardner had committed the killing during a burglary or in retaliation for Tammy's role as a witness in their pending divorce. Jurors do not need to agree on which aggravating factor is present, only that at least one exists beyond a reasonable doubt. Gardner's defense contended that there was insufficient evidence to prove he committed the murder or that either aggravating factor applied. They also attempted to block the admission of Tammy's 911 call as hearsay, but the court ruled that it qualified under the dying declaration exception. Gardner had a prior conviction in Mississippi for shooting his pregnant second wife, Rhoda Gardner, on December 31, 1982. He pleaded guilty for aggravated assault and received an 8-year sentence. Rhoda died during surgery about a month after he began serving his sentence. While in prison, Gardner became romantically involved with Margaret Westmoreland. After his release on parole, he moved in with her and her children, Becky, 13, and Tim, 6. Gardner threatened to kill Westmoreland and harm her children. He propositioned Becky and kidnapped Westmoreland at knife point. He was apprehended after a high-speed chase and his parole was revoked. He continued to threaten her from prison. Gardner was released from prison in 1995 and later married a woman named Sandra, with whom he had a son, Nicholas. They divorced in June 1999, and Sandra obtained a protective order against him in August 2001. Court records also showed that Gardner essayed Tammy's daughter Jessie when she was just 9 years old. During his trial, the jury found Gardner guilty of capital murder in November 2006 and sentenced him to death. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals upheld the conviction and sentence in October 2009, and all subsequent state and federal appeals were denied. The court noted that while physical evidence linking Gardner to the murder was minimal, the circumstantial evidence, combined with the lack of conflicting or exculpatory evidence, was sufficient to prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. They also confirmed that the burglary element was supported by ample evidence, though they did not address the retaliation element. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear Gardner's case, leaving no further appeals. His execution was scheduled and began at 6 p.m. on a Wednesday. Tammy's son, daughter, and mother attended, observing from a viewing room adjacent to the death chamber. During his final statement, Gardner addressed Tammy's family repeatedly, apologizing for the grief he caused. "I would like to say sorry for your grief," he said. "I hope that what I am doing today will give you peace, joy, closure, whatever it takes to forgive. I am sorry. I know you cannot forgive me, but I hope one day you will." He then addressed friends in another viewing room, expressing love for them and stating he desired to proceed with the execution so he could see the Lord Jesus. Gardner added, "I will ask Jesus to help them forgive me one day, please." He concluded, "I love you. Thank you, Warden." The lethal injection was administered, and Gardner was pronounced dead at 6:36 p.m. Abel Revill Ochoa, February 6, 2020. On the evening of Sunday, August 4, 2002, Abel Ochoa, who was 29 at the time, carried out a devastating attack on his family in their Dallas home, shooting 6 relatives and killing 5. According to a confession he signed on the day of the murders, Ochoa had been addicted to crack for approximately 2 years and had recently spent 2 months living in a drug rehabilitation house. Earlier that day, he had been driving home from church with his wife Cecilia and their daughters when he asked Cecilia for $10 to buy a bag of crack. Initially, she refused, but Ochoa eventually persuaded her to give him the money. With Cecilia and the children still in the car, he stopped at a known drug house and purchased the crack before returning home. Once home, he went into the backyard and smoked the drug. In his signed confession, Ochoa described the moment his craving returned while he was lying on the bed. Knowing from experience that asking his wife for more money would spark an argument, he went into the closet, retrieved a loaded Ruger 9mm pistol, and walked into the living room. There, he began shooting at the family members sitting on the couch. The victims were his wife Cecilia, 29, her father Bartolo Aliviso, 56, who lived with them, their 18-month-old daughter Anahi, and Cecilia's sisters Alma Aliviso, 27, and Jackie Sella, 20, who had come to visit. Ochoa could not recall whom he shot first, and after exhausting the first magazine, he returned to the bedroom to grab another before continuing the attack. During the shooting, his 7-year-old daughter Crystal attempted to flee, prompting Ochoa to chase her and fire at her as well. Afterward, he took his wife's purse, drove her Toyota 4Runner to a nearby shopping center, and attempted to withdraw cash from an ATM, but did not know the code. Uncertain of what to do next, he drove aimlessly for a few minutes before being stopped by police. Officers found a crack pipe on him. Neighbors had heard the gunfire and witnessed Alma running from the house, bloodied and screaming. They also provided police with descriptions of Ochoa's vehicle. 4 victims died at the scene, while baby Anahi succumbed to her injuries at a hospital. Alma was the sole survivor. Medical staff reported she required 42 units of blood to repair a major artery damaged during the shooting. Officer Cox, who arrested Ochoa, testified that he inquired about the location of the gun to ensure it posed no further threat. Ochoa replied that it was back at his house and admitted, "I couldn't handle the stress anymore." Shortly after, he reportedly said something to the effect of, "I got tired of my life." Additional trial testimony painted a picture of Ochoa's state and the moments leading up to the shooting. After returning home from smoking crack in the yard, he had walked past his guests without acknowledging them. Cecilia entered the bedroom to scold him for being rude to her sisters, to which he replied that he did not want them to witness how he was feeling. About 20 minutes later, around 6:10 p.m., he emerged and carried out the shootings before being arrested at 6:33 p.m. Pretrial news coverage noted that Cecilia had confided to family members that Ochoa was controlling and abusive and had struck her at least twice, although she had never reported these incidents to police. Ochoa, a Mexican-born U.S. citizen, had no prior criminal record. During the punishment phase of his trial, Ochoa testified that he could not remember the shootings except for reloading and firing the gun after seeing his daughter Crystal. He claimed to have no recollection of making the statements recorded in his confession to Detective Lusty, explaining that he would say, yeah, that's what happened," when the detective prompted him. When asked if he believed Lusty had fabricated the confession, Ochoa denied it, though he could not remember the details. The defense presented a doctor who testified that the shootings were the result of cocaine-induced delirium, during which Ochoa was not fully aware or in control of his actions. In contrast, a prosecution expert argued that the attack was driven by anger and frustration with his marriage and life, highlighting his lingering resentment over learning of Cecilia's son, Jonathan, from a previous marriage. The prosecution played a recording of a phone call between Ochoa and Cecilia during a prior separation, in which he threatened, "Well, see, you're starting to piss me off again. You want me to go shoot you right now?" Ochoa later testified that he would not have recalled making that threat had the tape not been played in court. Alma testified that 3 weeks before the murders, Ochoa had pointed a gun at her head. She also described his expression during the shootings as very mean, very angry. Based on this and other evidence, a jury found Ochoa guilty of the capital murder of his wife and daughter in May 2003, sentencing him to death. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals affirmed the conviction and sentence in January 2005, and all subsequent appeals in state and federal court were denied. On a prisoner art website, Ochoa later wrote, "Crack cocaine made me do things I would have never done. You know anybody on drugs? Tell them to get away. It'll get them nowhere but in prison." During his final statement at his execution, Ochoa thanked Jesus for his salvation and apologized to his victims' families. I would like to thank God, my dad, my Lord Jesus Savior for saving me and changing my life. I want to apologize to my in laws for causing all this emotional pain. I love y'all and consider y'all my sister I never had. I want to thank you for forgiving me. The lethal injection was then administered and he was pronounced dead at 6:48 p.m. Following the execution, Cecilia's son, Jonathan Duran, remarked, "After 17 years, me, my family, my grandfather, my aunts, and my uncles can finally say that we got closure. We got justice." Billy Joe Wardlow, July 8, 2020. On the morning of Sunday, June 13, 1993, 18-year-old Wardlow, accompanied by Tonya Fulfer, drove to the home of 82-year-old Carl Cole in Morris County in northeast Texas. Before approaching the house, Wardlow disconnected the exterior phone lines. He knocked on the door but received no answer. Over the course of the night, he returned twice more, still receiving no response. Finally, in the early hours of the morning, between 5 and 6 a.m., Wardlow and Fulfer returned once again. When the lights in the house came on, Carl Cole answered the door. Wardlow told him his car had broken down and asked to use the phone. Cole handed him a cordless phone through the door, but when Wardlow reported it was dead and requested another, Cole refused and began to close the door. At that moment, Wardlow drew a semi-automatic pistol and demanded that he be let inside. Cole lunged at him, grabbing his arm, but Wardlow shook him off and shot him between the eyes. After killing Cole, Wardlow entered the home, found the victim's wallet, wrapped his body in a blanket. He hid it in a closet, locking the door behind him. Wardlow and Fulfer then fled in Cole's truck, which had the keys inside. They stopped at Wardlow's mother's home to pick up some personal belongings before leaving the state. Later in the day, Cole's son, Charles, arrived at the home. Noticing the missing truck and some blood on the front steps, he initially assumed his father had been injured and gone for help. When he found the house's phones dead, he contacted a neighbor to call Morris County Sheriff Ricky Blackburn. Upon returning to the house, Charles observed that Cole, his wallet, and his keys were missing. Sheriff Blackburn arrived shortly thereafter and discovered a pair of broken glasses, a partial set of dentures, and blood near the carport. Authorities also noted the disconnected phone lines. An alert was issued and the pickup truck's registration was forwarded to the National Crime Information Center. Around midnight, Deputy Bill Barnard discovered Cole's checkbook on a small back road in Titus County, apparently discarded with other items. Before dawn on Tuesday, a Texas game warden and a state trooper accompanied Charles Cole back to the home for a thorough search, where they located Carl Cole's body in the closet. Meanwhile, in Nebraska, Wardlow had traded Cole's truck for a Ford Mustang and $8,000 in cash. Wardlow and Fulfer were eventually apprehended in South Dakota on Wednesday, June 16, with a .45 caliber semi-automatic pistol found under the passenger seat of their Mustang. While detained in the Morris County Jail, Wardlow wrote 2 notes to Sheriff Blackburn confessing to the murder. In these notes, he acknowledged killing Mr. Cole during a premeditated armed robbery, although the stated reasons for the shooting differed slightly. In the first note, Wardlow described shooting Cole right between the eyes in an execution-style act because Cole had angered him. In the second, he claimed he fired wildly during a struggle with Cole. At Wardlow's trial, moved to Titus County, the medical examiner testified that the weapon used in the murder matched the pistol recovered at the arrest. The firearm had been fired from a distance greater than 3 feet. Wardlow's mother testified that her .45 caliber semi-automatic and ammunition had been missing since the morning before the crime. Dorothy Smith, a caregiver for Cole's sister living nearby, testified that she had seen a young couple matching Wardlow and Fulfer's description outside Cole's home on the morning of the murder. She observed Wardlow with a gun handle visible in his back pocket and saw the woman following him under the carport. She heard a gunshot and saw the woman run from the carport a short time later. Although Wardlow had no prior felony convictions, evidence was introduced at his punishment hearing showing prior criminal behavior, including an arrest for fleeing a deputy and a report of failing to return a borrowed vehicle. Further evidence showed that while in jail, Wardlow had hidden a heavy metal bar in his cell and wrote threatening letters to Sheriff Blackburn and the jailer. The jury found Wardlow guilty of capital murder in February 1995 and sentenced him to death. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals upheld the conviction and sentence in April 1997. Wardlow waived his remaining appeals in 1997, then later rescinded the waiver, only to waive again in 1998. Subsequent appeals filed by lawyers without his consent were dismissed, and all state and federal appeals were ultimately denied. In a letter to the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles in June, Wardlow described himself as a changed man, reflecting that he arrived on death row as a scared boy who made poor choices and would leave a man others admire for enduring life's challenges with the support of those who loved him. The parole board also received letters from 57 Texas lawmakers urging a delay of his execution, citing neuroscientific research that young offenders' brains were not fully developed, and the board denied the request in a 6-1 vote. Due to the situation in 2020, precautions such as face masks were in place for witnesses in rooms adjacent to the death chamber. Wardlow chose not to make a final statement. The lethal injection was administered and he was pronounced dead at 6:28 p.m. Quinton Phillippe Jones, May 19, 2021. He was executed for the 1999 killing of his great-aunt Bertina Bryant. Before his execution, Bryant's family, along with over 120,000 people, petitioned Texas Governor Greg Abbott to commute his death sentence to a life sentence, but the request was denied. The execution took place without any media presence due to a communication error, making it the first execution in nearly 30 years in Texas to occur without journalists in attendance. Jones grew up in extremely difficult circumstances. He faced significant neglect and instability in his home life, experienced abuse within his family, and struggled with substance use at a young age. He also had periods of mental and emotional distress during his adolescence. Prosecutors argued that the death penalty was justified due to his history of violent behavior. On September 11, 1999, Jones killed his great-aunt during an incident while under the influence of drugs. Afterward, he took money from her home. Earlier that same year, Jones admitted to being involved in 2 other murders, though most of the responsibility in those cases was attributed to another individual, Ricky Russa, who was later convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The other murders were cited by the prosecution as part of their argument for imposing the death penalty. Prior to his execution, Jones gave a final statement. He thanked the people who had supported him throughout his life, including family members, friends, and others who had helped him in difficult times. He expressed gratitude for the positive influences in his life, spoke about the value of friendships, and expressed hope that he had left a positive impact on those around him. In closing, he acknowledged the warden and indicated he was ready to proceed. The execution was carried out via lethal injection and Jones was pronounced dead. John William Hummel, June 30, 2021. Hummel lived in Kennedale, part of the Dallas-Fort Worth area, with his wife Joy, their daughter Jody, and his father-in-law Clyde Bedford. He began a relationship with Krista Fries in October 2009 after meeting her at a convenience store he frequented on his way to his job as a security guard at an Arlington hospital. Their relationship became romantic and intimate in December, despite both being married. Hummel told Fries he did not love his wife, and she said she was finalizing a divorce. On December 10, Hummel informed Fries that his wife was pregnant. Fries initially asked him not to contact her anymore, but he continued to reach out. By December 16, Fries told him that her divorce was finalized. On the evening of December 17, Hummel visited Fries and her young daughter at their apartment in Joshua, about 25 miles southwest. Later that night, he returned home where he carried out a violent attack on his family and set the house on fire before leaving. Shortly after midnight, a passerby called 911 to report the house fire. Police and firefighters arrived quickly, but when the fire was extinguished, Hummel's family members were found deceased. Investigators noted evidence suggesting that the fire had been deliberately set. Hummel returned home around 4:30 a.m. He spoke to Officer Joshua Worthy, asking if everyone had made it out safely. He then sat in his minivan while police observed him. He was taken to the Kennedale Police Department, where he provided a written account of his movements that evening, claiming he had visited a friend, gone to several stores, and returned to find the house burned. During interviews, investigators noticed what appeared to be blood on his clothing, and Hummel provided an explanation for the stains. He consented to searches of his house and vehicle. Later, he went to work as usual, collecting his paycheck and attending meetings, which raised questions among coworkers when he did not return. Forensic investigation confirmed that the fire was intentionally set. Items were later recovered, including weapons that Hummel had used, and DNA evidence linked him to the scene. Hummel admitted to attempting to harm his family previously, including placing substances in a meal intended to make them sick, which had been discarded. Hummel, a former U.S. Marine, had no prior criminal record. A jury found him guilty of capital murder for the deaths of Clyde Bedford and Joy Hummel in June 2011 and sentenced him to death. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals affirmed the conviction in 2013, and all subsequent appeals were denied. His legal team did not file any last minute appeals. Hummel did not speak to the media during his decade on death row. His execution, originally scheduled for March 2020, was delayed due to the pandemic and related logistical issues. By the time of his execution, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice had updated procedures to ensure proper media coverage. At his execution, Hummel gave a brief final statement expressing regret for his actions and offering thanks for the support and prayers for his family. He acknowledged his death and expressed hope for peace in the afterlife. He was pronounced dead at 6:49 p.m. Family members later commented on the aftermath. Clyde Bedford's brother, Cecil, remarked on the method of execution, expressing personal feelings about it. Bedford's sister, Celinda, noted that the family home, which had been in their family for generations, was destroyed and subsequently sold. She expressed sorrow over Hummel's actions and the fact that the execution did not provide answers as to why such a tragedy occurred. Rick Allan Rhoades, September 28, 2021. On Thursday, September 12, 1991, Rhoades, 27, was released on parole from a Huntsville prison after serving 3 years of a 5-year sentence for vehicle theft and burglary of a habitation. Rather than reporting to his designated halfway house in Beaumont, he took a bus to Houston. After an unsuccessful attempt to locate his parents, Rhoades went to an apartment complex where he had previously lived, consuming several beers there. He then wandered around the neighborhood until approximately 2:30 a.m. on September 13, when he encountered Charles Allan, 31, outside his home. According to Rhoades, Allan told him to leave, which led to a staring match between them. Allan eventually went inside, and Rhoades, fearing that Allan might retrieve a gun, followed him. Inside, Rhoades picked up a small metal bar from a weight bench and entered the kitchen, where Allan had grabbed a knife. A struggle ensued, during which Rhoades struck Allan with the bar, causing him to drop the knife. Rhoades then took the knife and stabbed Allan multiple times, resulting in his death. The noise awakened Allan's brother, Bradley, 33, who entered the kitchen and engaged in a struggle with Rhoades, ultimately being fatally stabbed as well. Afterward, Rhoades took cash from the home and changed into some clean clothes belonging to the brothers. He then went to an unoccupied apartment and took a shower. The bodies of the Allan brothers were discovered later that morning by a neighbor. Police found bloody footprints at the scene, but no usable fingerprints. A month later, Rhoades was apprehended while burglarizing an elementary school in Pasadena. While in custody, he told police that he had information regarding a double homicide and admitted to killing the Allan brothers, stating he was tired of running. He explained that seeing a news report of their deaths on the morning they occurred had been weighing on him ever since. Rhoades had a criminal record with 4 prior convictions in Indiana and Texas, primarily for home and auto burglaries, and had been granted parole 3 times. In July 1992, a jury found him guilty of capital murder and sentenced him to death. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals affirmed the conviction and sentence in October 1996, and all subsequent state and federal appeals were denied. Janice Andrews, sister of the Allan brothers, expressed her feelings about the execution. "I will be happy for the day when there are no more appeals. We just want it over." Although she identified as a political liberal and had reservations about the death penalty in general, she believed this case was an exception. The execution was attended by a brother and sister-in-law of the victims, as well as Bradley Allan's daughter, Marley Holt, who was born during the trial. Holt explained, "He watched my dad die, so I wanted to watch him die." The U.S. Supreme Court denied Rhoades' final appeal roughly an hour before the scheduled execution. No one attended on Rhoades' behalf, and he did not request a spiritual advisor. As he stood on the gurney, he briefly looked toward the victims' relatives. Rhoades declined to make a final statement when asked by the warden. The lethal injection was administered, and he was pronounced dead at 6:29 p.m. Kevin Allan, one of the victim's brothers, said afterwards, "It's a weird feeling. I can't really describe what it's like. It's the most solemn thing I think I've ever been part of, if that's the word that's even appropriate." Carl Wayne Buntion, April 21, 2022. On Wednesday, June 27, 1990, Houston police officer James Irby, 37, pulled over a vehicle in Houston for a traffic violation. As he spoke with the driver, John Killingsworth, 42, the passenger, Buntion, then 46, shot him once in the head with a revolver. Buntion then exited the vehicle, walked around to the front, and shot Irby twice more in the back while he lay on the ground before fleeing on foot. A bystander used the radio on Irby's patrol motorcycle to call for help. During his escape, Buntion fired at a witness during a failed carjacking attempt. He shot at another officer and held another person at gunpoint. He eventually fled into a nearby warehouse where he surrendered and was captured. Authorities later found heroin in the trunk of the vehicle Killingsworth and Buntion had been in. Buntion had a lengthy criminal history with at least 7 prior felony convictions dating back to when he was 17. His record included vehicle theft, burglary, normal theft, property damage, and possession of narcotics. He had been returned to prison on 3 separate occasions for violating the terms of his release. His most recent conviction had been for essay of a child while he was on parole. He began serving a 15-year sentence in April 1989 and was paroled a year later. At that time, parole for repeat felony offenders was common in Texas due to strict prison population caps imposed by U.S. District Judge William Wayne Justice. On the day of his execution, a crowd of supporters of Officer Irby, including numerous Houston police officers on motorcycles and other law enforcement personnel, gathered outside the prison, while anti-death penalty protesters assembled on the opposite side of the street. Family members of both Irby and Buntion observed the execution from separate viewing rooms adjacent to the death chamber. During his final statement, Buntion thanked his family and supporters, addressing 5 by name. He then addressed the victim's family. "I have a message to the Irby family. The shootout occurred June 27, 1990. He recounted a visit he received in jail 1 week later from off-duty sheriff's deputy Michael Garrett, who gave him a small Bible, read from it, and encouraged him to accept Jesus Christ." Buntion continued, "I wanted the Irby family to know one thing. I do have remorse for what I did. I pray to God that they get the closure for me killing their father and Mrs. Irby's husband." He also addressed the Irby children directly, saying, "I hope to see you in heaven someday, and when you show up, I will give you a big hug." He concluded his statement by thanking his friends again. "I am not going to say goodbye, just saying so long, I am ready to go." Following this, the lethal injection was administered, and Buntion was pronounced dead at 6:39 p.m. Please hit that subscribe button if you like my channel. See you next time. Bye bye.